Madam President.
Democratic Whip.
Madam President, imagine this. In one of the great nations of the world, there is a controversy over a transition of power, the peaceful transfer of power. And in this country, those who are about to lose power are concerned. So concerned that their backers are turning to the streets. They plan on demonstrations against the supposed new leadership in their country, and people fear violence. It was against this background that Nadav Argaman, the director of Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, made a rare public intervention on Saturday night, warning of discourse that is, quote, liable to be interpreted by certain groups or by individuals as one that permits violent and illegal activity that is liable, heaven forbid, to reach mortal injury, end of quote. Without mentioning any politicians directly, Mr. Argaman added, quote, it's our duty to come out with a clear and decisive call to stop immediately the inciting and violent discourse. The responsibility for calming spirits and reining in the discourse rests on all of our shoulders. I bring this matter to the floor of the Senate because it parallels what we endured and experienced just a few months ago. I'm sure you remember it well, Madam President. I do. An election last November, which was won by Joseph Biden over Donald Trump, the incumbent president, by some 7 million votes, one of the largest turnouts, if not the largest turnout in the history of the United States. A decisive electoral college victory, the same margin that Trump had triumphed over Hillary Clinton just a few years before. And yet, because of the big lie and the denial by Donald Trump, he inspired his followers to come to Washington, D.C. and participate in a rally to protest. And not to come just any day, but to come on January 6th of 2021 this year, because that's when the Electoral College votes are going to be counted. We know what followed. We know that mob was turned loose in the streets of Washington and turned loose on the Capitol building, and those of us who were here that day will never forget it. I can recall the Vice President of the United States being pulled from that chair that you're sitting in, Madam President, taken out that door. It was about 2:15 in the afternoon, and then a member of the Capitol Police stood before us and warned us, stay in your seats, this will be a safe place to be. We're going to gather all the staff around the walls here. Just sit tight. 10 minutes later, he came back and said, change of plans. The mob is advancing on this chamber as we speak. Leave immediately. And everyone picked up as fast as they could and left. It was a scene that seemed so unrealistic. You wouldn't imagine it could happen in the capital of the United States of America. But the insurrectionist mob, inspired by President Donald Trump, was here for business. They were here to stop the ordinary course of business in the Senate and the House, which would announce at the end of the day the selection of Joseph Biden as our new president. Now a parallel is taking place in Israel, and a new coalition to replace Bibi Netanyahu is being contested by those who are going to march in the streets. And the Israeli leaders, at least those in the security services, are begging people not to do it. I put that in context to think that that idea in the United States somehow has taken root in Israel. I pray that nothing happens. I want nothing to happen there. But we should be forewarned to take this seriously. If there are forces at work in the United States and Israel and other countries to stop the orderly transfer of power in a democratic nation, we ought to take that seriously. We ought to take it so seriously that we appoint a bipartisan commission to investigate what happened here on January 6, 2021. Just a few weeks ago, Republican members of the House of Representatives were dismissing the January 6th events, the mob action here in the Capitol, and saying that they were somehow orderly tourists. That's what one of the congressmen said, a congressman from Georgia, Republican. Those were orderly tourists. Look at those videos and imagine under any circumstance that you would describe them as orderly tourists. They weren't orderly tourists when we see 5 people losing their lives as a result of their actions and 140 of our law enforcement officials being personally attacked, many of them still bearing the scars of that day. I bring this to the attention of the Senate and the American people because I think the answer is obvious. Israel's taken it seriously. They don't want a Trump-like mob to take control in their country. We shouldn't be allowing this to happen, nor should we stop with what we've done and say no more will be said. This was a direct attack on our democracy. We cannot find, unfortunately, in Republican leadership, one Republican leader who will support this idea of a bipartisan commission. And when it comes to January 6th, the job isn't finished. The last point I'll make is we received a letter, an anonymous letter, from the Capitol Hill Police asking us to form this commission and get to the bottom of it. To think that we walk through this Capitol every day and those men and women are risking their lives for us, and we would not even allow a bipartisan commission to look into that day and the threats to the lives of those policemen on that day is shameful. It's disgraceful. It's unacceptable. Senator Schumer said we'll vote on it again. I hope we do, and frequently, so we can remind the American people who is taking that event very seriously and who is not. Madam President, on another issue, another topic, when the pandemic was first declared in March of last year, we entered a world of uncertainty. We were confronted with reality that our schools and our workplaces were going to be shut down in the foreseeable future. Family gatherings and get-togethers were going to be restrained, and our favorite places for relaxing and fun, restaurants and stores, were basically closed. But amid all these uncertainties, one thing remained constant and dependable: our domestic food supply. Despite the disruptions, panic buying, supply chain bottlenecks that arose during the pandemic, our domestic food supply remained fundamentally intact every step of the way. Over the past year, most of us have had the assurance when we stopped at the grocery store, there was plenty of food for our family. And when grocery store shelves started to run empty, we could always trust that more food was on the way, because farmers were doing their job and distributors of food supply were doing the same. It goes to show that thanks to American agriculture, we're blessed by abundance. And as we've come together to commend the courageous doctors, nurses, and other frontline workers who've cared for our loved ones, there's another group of essential workers who have toiled alongside our farmers and ranchers to keep our families fed: farm workers. I'm sure most Americans know very little about the farm workers who supply the food we eat every day. In Illinois, we have 20,000 of these farm workers. They plant, harvest, pick our state's most lucrative crops. And across the country, we have about 2.5 million farm workers. Roughly half of these 2.5 million are undocumented. These undocumented farm workers are part of our communities, and many are parents of American children. But despite the essential work they do to keep our families fed, their second-class status in America means that they are often subject to harassment, untenable working conditions, substandard housing, and they live under a constant threat of deportation. Earlier this month, the Guardian News Service published a piece on the working and living conditions for farm workers in southern Texas. I want to share a few passages about one worker in particular. Her name is Linda. Nina Lacani writes that Linda, quote, works 6 days a week, sometimes 7, putting food on American tables, but earns barely enough to cover the bills and depends on food stamps to feed her family and her children. After long days in the field, Linda sleeps on an old couch in the kitchen lounge part of the house, a house that was found uninhabitable because of a fire and hurricane, but she calls it home. Her 11-year-old son, who has some learning disorders, sleeps on the other couch. 2 daughters share a bedroom where water leaks through the moldy roof. The eldest, a 16-year-old, and her 6-month-old baby sleep in a room with cinder walls. Last summer, Linda and her 3 teenage daughters contracted COVID-19. Rather than risk going to an emergency room, a relative with legal immigration status crossed the border to Reynosa and brought back a small tank of oxygen for Linda. Linda has lived in the United States of America for more than 25 years. She's one of the many undocumented farm workers who keep my family and our families fed. Yet she herself can barely afford to feed her own family. Her experience isn't an isolated one. I want to share one last passage from that article in The Guardian. Quote, "Even before the pandemic, farms were among the most dangerous workplaces in the country. Low-paid workers have little protection, long hours, repetitive strain injuries, exposures to pesticides, dangerous machinery, extreme heat, and animal waste. Now add this contagious virus that these workers face too." According to the Environmental Working Group, more than a dozen states don't provide any form of PPE or COVID testing for farm workers, and there are no social distancing guidelines in place on these farms. In some cases, workers arrive to the fields in tightly packed trucks, and their crews reportedly share cups of water from the same cup during the day. I think it would be accurate to classify these working conditions as dangerous. But these essential workers don't have the luxury of being able to advocate for themselves because they're always under the shadow and risk of deportation. We in the Senate can change that. We can pass a piece of bipartisan legislation that has already passed the House. It's called the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. This legislation would fundamentally change the lives of hundreds of thousands of these farm workers who came to our rescue during the darkest days of the pandemic, who kept working despite the threat of COVID-19 and the fact that they had few creature comforts of their own. This is legislation that has been in the making for years. It would provide a path to lawful, permanent residency for undocumented farm workers and their family members. That means they'd be able to do the essential work they've already been doing without living in fear of being deported and losing their kids. It also means these workers could advocate for higher wages, safer working conditions, which would make our nation's farm labor force more stable, strengthen the durability of our food supply chain. Offering these farm workers a path to permanent residency is the least we can do to acknowledge their tireless, back-breaking work during this pandemic. Over the past year, we've heard a lot of praise for the essential workers of America. I've joined in that chorus. In our time of need, they did their job, and sometimes at great personal cost. Now it's time to do our job and pass the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. Enacting this legislation is not just about doing the right thing for the workers. It's about doing the right thing for our economy and doing the right thing, period. When the pandemic first hit last year, it caused the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. 22 million jobs vanished in America. Millions of working families lost their source of income, and some, for the first time in their lives, struggled to put food on the table. Can you imagine how much worse this crisis would have been if our nation was saddled with a food scarcity crisis as well? Thanks to our farmers and these farm workers I'm speaking for today, we never faced it. It's one of the many examples of how immigrants make America stronger. We take them for granted. They go to work every day and do the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs in America. Now we have to do something for them. According to last year's census, America's population grew at the slowest rate since the 1930s. That's a warning sign for the future of our economy. If our population growth continues to slow, our nation's tax base will shrink. It means we'll have fewer working-age adults who can help support elderly Americans, a population that's expected to double over the next few decades. To grow our economy, we need to bring people out of the shadows so they can continue to contribute to America for years to come. So when we vote on legislation like the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, we're really voting for our economic future. I'd like to remind my colleagues that America didn't build the world's greatest economy by closing our doors, crossing our fingers, and doing one another's laundry. We did it by welcoming the workers of the world, by offering them a home where they could earn an honest living, pay their fair share, and secure a brighter future for their children. Many people say, well, we want to get those PhDs from India and China and Asia. We want them living here. They're going to be good for our economy. They're going to create businesses. That's all true. I stand behind that as well. But there are also many workers who don't have that level of education, but have a determination and a work ethic that has always been part of success in the American economy. This unique American promise, build a brighter future for their children as well as ours, is the bedrock of our nation. No other country in the world can deprive us of it. We can only deprive ourselves by refusing to fix a broken immigration system that leaves millions of hardworking families in the shadows of our society. If we want to continue leading the 21st century, we want America to be in first place and not in second place, we need to keep the American promise alive. And we need to do it by passing the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, joining together in support of comprehensive immigration reform. Madam President, the issue of immigration, as you probably know, has become a passion of mine. I know it's one of yours. You mentioned to me the other day in passing that you are the only true immigrant in the Senate. And it's, I guess, historic that I would give this speech and you would be presiding over the Senate as I do. I'm sure you feel as I do. These people go to work every single day. They do the dirtiest, hardest, most dangerous work in America. And they do it without any hope of a great future because they're undocumented. They have no future. That person they're working for this week may decide on Friday not to pay them anything. Are they going to go to court to fight for their rights as workers? Probably not. They don't feel they have any rights being undocumented. But a good thing has happened here years ago when our coalition of senators, Democrats and Republicans, put together a farm worker provision, and now the House has done it for us again. They've led the way with the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, passed it in the Senate here. It's time for us to take this measure up. I've talked to a number of our Republican friends. Many of them are from agricultural states. They understand it and they support it. They want to be part of it. You'd be surprised if I told their names on the floor, but I'm going to be careful not to. They're worried because of this issue of immigration and its controversy, but they understand the fairness of it all. I want to salute Michael Bennet, a senator from Colorado, who's been a leader on this subject from the start. Years ago with our coalition effort, Gang of Eight effort, he was the person who put together the farm worker provision. I think Dianne Feinstein was a great contributor in that effort as well. Michael Bennet is back again, working for this bill. We ought to take this up. We ought to do it this week. We ought to pass it out of the Senate, the bill that passed the House. And in so doing, we'd be doing a favor for essential workers, some of the lowest paid, hardest working people in America. It's only right, and I hope we do it soon. Madam President, I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.